Morgan Bonaparte Mizell, known as Bone, was born in Orange County in 1863 to cattlemen Morgan Mizell and Mary Fletcher Tucker. The family had recently relocated from Hernando County to the sparsely populated area of Horse Creek in Manatee County, Florida. As pioneers, they had 12 children and an uncle Enoch who stayed close by. Bone's middle name, Bonaparte, was inspired by his father's fascination with the French ruler, and unlike him, Bone grew to an impressive 6 feet 5 inches. In youth, Bone watched the events of the Civil War unfold and later Reconstruction in what journalists called not the Old West, but the Old East. Extreme poverty plagued the South, and Florida looked to the cattle ranchers to save the state. When the Union allowed Florida ports to reopen, cattlemen could ship their beef to areas like Cuba and build cash, which Spanish currency dominated at the time. For Bone, schools were strict, with teachers relying on hickory switches or timeout cells for misbehavior. He preferred riding horses over attending school, but due to a lisp and a slight wheeze, he was also an easy target by neighborhood boys after school. In response, he developed a sharp wit and became known as a notorious prankster. Former DeSoto County Sheriff Les DeShong remarked that Bone's appearance and manner of speaking were naturally amusing. Lifelong DeSoto resident Gene Harn noted, "Bone didn't mean to be funny, it just came out that way." With minimal schooling, Bone could barely write his name. Not far from the Mizells were the Barbers, specifically Old Moses, who had recently moved to Kenansville, south of the rowdy Orlando. Before the war, Moses had one of the largest cattle empires in the state. But after his livestock fed the Union troops and his 100 slaves were taken as contraband, Moses also lost his son at the Battle of Gettysburg. Meanwhile, the Mizell clan, led in part by Bone's grandfather, David Sr., had 4 fighting in the war, with sons Thomas and Joshua not returning home. Morgan served in James Breaker's Old Guards and was wounded at the bloody Battle of Ulusty, a Union defeat. Bone's Uncle John, now a judge, and Uncle David, a sheriff, were involved in the Orange County government, and their order was firm, with locals calling them carpetbaggers and Yankees. In the middle of this was the pro-Confederate Barber family, which was penalized with high taxes on their cattle. The hostility between the family grew, and the Mizells aimed to make an example of Jackson Jack Barber, who was in and out of jail. Jack's nephew, Deed Barber, was caught retrieving Moses's steer on Bone's father's property. David wanted to arrest him on sight, but Bone's father talked down their cousins and decided to slaughter the animal and divide the meat between the families. 1868, Old Moses was behind in taxes, and Sheriff David Mizell took his herd as collateral. This enraged Old Moses, who refused to give money to Yanks. The Barbers argued they would see them in court, but before trial, the courthouse was subjected to arson, having found jugs of turpentine in the area, and so too went up the jail. In February 1870, Moses was again under scrutiny for an unpaid bill of sale. Judge John sent his brother David to make the arrest. On the evening of the 21st, David took Bone's father Morgan and his son Billy, seeing no danger in the ride, but upon stopping to rest at Bull Creek, shots rang out over the small camp, fatally wounding David and leaving the boys in a panic. Morgan rode back to Orlando for help while Billy stayed to comfort his father. In the last words, Sheriff David begged the family not to avenge his death. But Judge John, upon hearing the news, called out, "Bring the barbers to justice and take no prisoners doing it." The acting Sheriff Stewart arrested Barber's family members, and the posse tied Moses Jr.'s son, Isaac, to a tree, shooting him to death. Old Moses Jr., and Jack left their ranch as Isaac's widow stayed behind to curse the oncoming posse. The cattle were taken, and Judge John returned to Orlando. A few posse members decided to track old Moses, Jack, and Moses Jr., but were only able to apprehend Moses Jr. As the story goes, the lawman shackled him in irons before nightfall and claimed he tried to escape. His body was found drowned and riddled with bullets. The weeks that followed were bloody against the Barber family, with 8 more deaths, sparking a feud that would last into the 20th century with over 41 slain. When Bone reached 15, Horse Creek became the site of Pine Level, the county seat of Manatee County, which later became part of DeSoto County. By this time, Bone had spent many years working cattle with his father. In those days, cowboys were called cowmen, cow hunters, or cow herders. Bone was renowned for his riding skills, often riding Florida-bred miniature horses known as Arshtackies. He was a skilled rider who could snap a fly off of a cow's rear with an 18-foot bullwhip without flinching the animal. Bone also had an exceptional talent for recognizing and remembering cattle and their brands. During roundups, if a cowman needed to identify a particular brand, Bone was the source. He was highly skilled at matching cows with their calves and had a sharp intellect for identifying and recalling all the brands and earmarks. Florida cattle roam freely across the scrubby landscape from Orlando to the upper Everglades until the fence law was passed in 1949. Bone's skills made him a highly sought-after cowman. Judge Zeba King of Fort Ogden, one of the Florida's largest cattle owners, hired Bone as a ranch foreman. Bone oversaw at least 50,000 head of cattle and supervised 9 men. He also ventured into retail by opening a grocery store, but his lack of schooling hindered his ability to manage the books and track debt. When the grocery store failed, Bone returned to cow hunting, where he could utilize his natural talents. Bone would go on to work for other cattle ranchers in south central Florida, including Captain Hendry of LaBelle, cattle baron Eli O. Morgan, and the Parker brothers. Bone, having been raised during the Barber-Mizell feud, learned to look the other way when the law was not in his favor. This led to his arrest on several occasions for cattle rustling and changing brands. While many stories about Bone exist, he is undoubtedly a fixture of Florida folklore, and exaggerations are intertwined with the truth. One favorite story occurred in DeSoto County when Sheriff Les DeShong arrived at a poker game at the Hollingsworth home. The players included Zeb Parker, Russell King, A.C. Williams, Maury, A.P. Hollingsworth, and Bone, who were at the table, shuffling cards and placing poker chips. The sheriff halted the game, declaring, "You're all under arrest." Bone responded that they were playing with chips, not money. The sheriff countered, "Chips are the same as money." The next day in court, Bone had to pay a fine of $85 or stay in jail. After the others paid their fines, Bone approached the judge and counted $85 in poker chips. The judge protested that the fine had to be paid in real money. Bone replied, "The sheriff said chips are the same as money." After a moment of shock, the judge laughed and let him go. Bone had an impressive physical presence, tall and slim, causing his long legs to dangle below the stirrups. His skin was leathery, wrinkled, and tan, appearing older than his age. Fast becoming known across Florida prairie, Bone was a man who preferred sleeping outside and had a deep love for whiskey, which he drank often, fully aware it might one day be the death of him. One night after drinking heavily, a group of cowboys carried him to a cemetery and left him among the gravestones. When Bone woke the following morning, he looked around and said, "Here it is, Judgment Day, and I'm the first one up." Another story involves Willie Williams, a cattleman and former schoolteacher. Willie was staying at Fort Bassinger and moving along a herd of cattle to the Fort Pierce market. Bone rode in from Arcadia on an annual visit to friends the night before. He offered Willie his assistance. The cattle were put in the pens and preparation began for supper. It was in the fall and the country was dry, with most of the ponds having nothing but muddy puddles. Bone elected to get water for the coffee and said, "I know where a gator hole is in a pond over yonder." The other cowboys said, "Okay, fine," as they cooked a pot of grits and fried bacon. After the meat was put on plates, a can of tomatoes was poured into the grease of the frying pan. Buttermilk biscuits and baked sweet potatoes topped it off and were taken from the saddlebags, having been warmed by the horse's natural body temperature. All was set except for the water. Then Bone came back yelling, "Boys, I just saw the dangest catfight I've ever saw in my life. On the edge of that flagged pond, two old bobcats were fighting and growling at one another. All at once they stood up facing each other like two men slapping and growling. Then, like a streak of lightning, they clinched and climbed over one another, and so you know what? Boys, I stood right there and watched them climb clear out of sight." Well, they dismissed Bone's tale, but the next night Bone said he'd get the water, to which they replied, "Don't be so long this time." Shortly after, Bone returned with the water, and the boys joked, "Any sight of the bobcats this trip?" He replied, "No, boys, but I guess they are still fighting as the fur is still falling." By the late 1890s, cattle rustling was rampant, and Bone was rumored to be stealing for a cattle king. In 1896, he was convicted and sentenced to 2 years in state prison. While many of his friends circulated a petition for Bone's pardon, they were told he'd have to serve some time. So Bone was put on a train to prison with a brand new set of clothes bought by his friends and given a grand send-off. Upon arriving, the warden treated him royally with a tour of the facilities and an invitation to dinner. One can only imagine how Bone got out of this one. Having served his time, no matter how little it was, Bone was pardoned and took the train home the next day. On another occasion, the judge grilled the cowpoke. "How you pleadin', Bone?" Bone presented himself to the jury and announced, "Now you look here, Judge, I've stole hundreds of cattle and put your mark on 'em. Just 'cause I stole a few from you, you go and have me indicted. You just better get this whole deal nolly process dismissed pronto." Bone walked free out of the embarrassed court. Cowboy artist Frederick Remington traveled from New York City to Florida to paint and document the everyday lives of cowboys. Here he found his muse in Bone and painted Cracker Cowboy for publication in Harper's Magazine. He described two skinny ponies wearing wild-looking individuals whose hanging hair and drooping hats and generally unkempt appearance would remind you at once of the Spanish moss, which hangs so quietly and helplessly to the limbs of the oaks out in the swamps. There was none of the bilious fierceness and rearing plunge that I had associated with my friends out west. They had on about $4 worth of clothes between them. Bone appeared with his cohorts in other paintings published in the August 1895 issue of Harper's New Monthly Magazine. One painting shows Bone on his horse with his dog beside him. Most locals did not take too kindly to Remington's criticisms, calling them cracker cowboys, and excused his disposition as that of a tin horn Yankee. The term goes way back, but during this period, a cracker was described for the bull whip used by cowhands. Eventually, the moniker stuck and evolved into Florida Cracker, a name now embraced for descendants of Florida cattle herders. Bone never settled down, but did frequent the bordellos where he became a favorite patron. It was said that this was about the only place he slept in a bed, having no home to call his own. On July 14th, 1921, Bone had just spent the night at Joshua Creek at the home of his friend Leslie H. Avant and arrived in the morning for Arcadia by train for Fort Ogden. He sent a wire to the Like brothers in Tampa for money, then lay on the bench in the depot. Robert Morgan, son of E. H. Morgan, the Atlantic Coast Line railway agent, said he was worried about Bone and asked him to sit up. Bone did so and remarked, "Yeah, I'd better not lie down, I might die." Robert left for lunch, and when he returned, found Bone there lying dead. Dr. Oren was called and pronounced him that way. A fellow asked him how he knew the doctor hadn't tested him, and Dr. Oren said, "Don't have to test him. I know that old Bone would be testing a good 90 proof right now." The undertaker, L.L. Morgan, entered the cause of death as moonshine when went to sleep and did not wake up. Bone was 58 and died with his boots on. His funeral was held the next day at the home of his nephew, Jesse Mizell Jr., and he was buried at Joshua Creek Cemetery. His grave marker contains several errors, including his birth, but it was also erected on the wrong grave. His family, though, relocated it to the proper site without the mistakes corrected. Perhaps a last joke for us all from Bone. This has been Biographies of the West. My name is Lorin Morgan-Richards. Thanks for watching.